Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. There's still a few people logging in, so we're going to get started in just a few minutes. Hello, everyone. I'm going to go ahead and get started. My name is Brian DiPaolo, and I'm the Director of Strategic Services for Accudata Systems. I will be moderating today's webinar. And thank you for joining us, and welcome to another Accudata bi-monthly PCI Qualified Security Assessor Open Forum. Each session continues to get better with more interesting questions presented to our QSA, so again, we appreciate you joining. Today, we're joined by two extremely knowledgeable QSA experts. First, I'd like to introduce Risk and Compliance Consultant, Senior Consultant Tim Sills. Tim has extensive experience with security of credit card information, which dates back to Visa's original Cardholder Information Security Program in 2001, before the PCI Council was even formed. With more than 20 years' experience, Tim works with Accudata's customers and routinely provides guidance and interpretation of PCI requirements, and is keen to offer paths towards compliance through a low-impact business approach. Secondly, I'd like to introduce Senior Consultant Steve Martinson. Steve has extensive audit experience as well as real-world compliance program development in previous roles, including Chief Information Security Officer, enabling him as a PCI QSA. For those of you who don't know Accudata, here's a quick background. We've been in business for over 35 years, serving some of those same customers for over 20 of those years. We have a team of 80-plus consultants in 7 practices with a strong history of employee retention. Across our 10-plus QSAs, we average over 6 years of retention per employee, enabling true partnerships with our customers. Over the past year, we performed over 40-plus PCI DSS assessments and ROCs. And lastly, Accudata Systems guarantees our statements of work to ensure you are always satisfied and gain maximum value from our services. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few action items. First, because this is an open forum, feel free to ask questions through the chat window in your browser. We did receive some questions during the registration period, so we'll ask those first and then move on to your questions afterward. If you're unable to get your question answered today, we will respond personally to your questions through email. Please allow approximately 72 hours or up to 72 hours for those responses. After the webinar today, each attendee will receive a post-event email that will include a full recording of today's webinar, as well as a copy of the slides and some of the resources to help you with your PCI compliance. With that said, we're going to go ahead and get started. We appreciate you joining us. So let's move forward with our first question. So I'm going to go ahead and start with Tim. With that, Tim Sills, now that PCI 3.2 is live, what do I need to make sure I'm doing? What do I need to make sure I'm doing to maintain compliance?
Sure. Hey, Brian. So there certainly are a few controls that were previously best practices that are now required as of February 1st. So, like multi-factor authentication being one of the key ones. So, I think it's important to kind of get in front of these controls as soon as you can, as well as staying on top of the routine tasks. So, performing, like the daily log reviews and the quarterly scanning, and so all these other routine activities as well. I think the key takeaway here is just maintaining compliance is an ongoing process. So look to get an action plan together sooner rather than later. Don't wait for the QSA to show up before getting started on some of these. So that would be, I think, the key plan of action.
Steve, do you have anything you want to add to that?
Hey, Brian, thanks. Actually, that's a good overall approach according to what Tim said. I think I would add that there are several requirements that were specific to service providers only that were added in 3.2 that went live on February 1st. And they're really more about expanding what a service provider documents with respect to how they support their customers and clients. So things like cryptographic architecture in requirement 3.5.1, their key management processes if they're doing so for their clients for 3.6, and how they would respond to a security control failure overall for 10.8.1, since they are supporting the PCI compliance of their customers. But I would definitely take a look at that if you're a service provider to make sure you're following those guidelines.
Thanks, Steve. We'll move on to the next question. So this one I'll go back to you, Steve. So regarding the security of incoming faxes, if a fax machine is in a locked container but the room is open, does that conform, or is that compliant?
Yeah, PCI is pretty specific with respect to physical security and the handling of cardholder data that may end up on a printed document like a fax. And that's requirement 9.5. And in this case, I was having a hard time trying to picture what a fax machine in a locked container actually looks like. But given that that's the scenario, you have to make sure that your policies define how that cardholder data is protected. And your policy states you've got it in a locked cabinet or container, that the physical connection for the data line to that fax machine is protected, wherever it is on the wall, or demarked whether it's in the same room or a different room. What is done with that hard copy document once it's received, physically handled, where does it go? And once the information that's on that document is processed for your payment activity or whatever reason it was received by you, how do you store and or destroy it? And what are those guidelines with regard to retention and how you do that? Now, as far as the container is concerned, I would ask, as a QSA, how the access to that is controlled. Who has a key to that cabinet where that fax machine is? And why do they have the key? Is it because they're a manager? And what roles are allowed to have that? And I think a bigger thing is, what do you do with regard to validating the access is correct once you have an authorized person leave the company or gets terminated? So those you have to be able to clearly define and demonstrate to a QSA when they're either on-site or interview you for those requirements.
Thanks, Steve. Next question, which is not a surprising one, I'll direct this back towards Tim, who actually has done quite a bit of work with AWS lately, is how do cloud services impact my PCI compliance efforts?
Okay. Well, yeah, certainly we've had several customers that have had, a presence in the cloud. Yeah, the approach is the same in a sense, partially in the sense that we're looking at applied patches, hardening of systems, controlled access, to the environment, things of that nature. But more importantly, I think the key item here is that the QSA needs to have some familiarity with the cloud provider's method of applying these various controls, right? So like with AWS, they use security groups for the firewalling functionality, right? So having an understanding of that cloud provider's tools and nomenclature is just as important, and having a comfort level with that as well. So in the end, the approach is relatively the same. It's just having a comfort level with the console and the interface and how those controls are implemented.
Thanks, Tim. So with that, let's move on to our fourth question that was submitted. That question is: my bank has requested PCI certification for 2019. What are my first steps towards becoming compliant?
Oh yeah, this is a common question, and having been in this business for so long, it does still happen that people really haven't had the impetus to actually go and tackle PCI with a defined program. But there are ways that you can get some quick wins with regard to getting your compliance program rolling. The PCI Council has something called a prioritized approach, which basically creates a list of milestones across the 12 high-level PCI requirements, and it allows you to plan for a longer-term project to address the most high-risk gaps in your compliance program first, and that's at the highest priority of the overall plan. It'll support your financial and operational planning, and it gives you a good way to measure your progress. And that prioritized approach is known amongst Tim and me and all the other QSAs. So it's something we're familiar with. So if you're using that as a way to kind of frame and map your compliance program, it'll be easy for a QSA to come in there and see your progress and further follow up on any gaps that they see on that, and give you a going forward plan.
Yeah, and one of the things I would highlight, we deal with a lot of different customer scenarios of how they use credit card data, and ultimately one of the biggest things that impacts everything that you do in PCI is scope. So to add on to what Steve was stating about the prioritized approach from the PCI Council, part of it is just understanding what your scope is and how you take credit card data. Because obviously where that can be reduced, you can avoid bringing your whole network into scope. And we've even seen scenarios where business processes are changed, and we often recommend that. I think earlier one of the questions was fax machines or using faxes. We had a scenario with a customer that was receiving about 300 faxes a year that contained credit card data, and so brought in their entire fax infrastructure, which did a lot of other things in the scope. One of the simple changes they made was just eliminating that as a way that they would accept credit card data, and it took all of that out of scope. So there's definitely there's definitely an approach to get started, and reducing scope is definitely one of the first things you want to do. So
hey,
with that said, let's.
Absolutely.
Oh, I'm sorry, Tim. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, I was just going to add to that real quickly. You can't boil the ocean, right? So we also recommend that. Gap assessments, right? So get an initial lay of the land. So do an initial gap assessment. So it's a short engagement. It's only a couple of days long, but it kind of quickly gives you a roadmap and a punch list, and it's based upon that prioritized approach as well, right? So that's always a good starting point.
Thanks, Tim. So, Tim, I'll actually come back to you with this question. What should I be looking for when I'm inspecting my POS devices for evidence of tampering, which is one of the newer requirements in 3.2?
Okay. Yeah. Well, first and foremost, right? I mean, there should be some documented process that for the cashiers and the folks or the store manager to do that. But first thing is making sure that the device itself hasn't even been swapped out, so the model is the same. looking for obvious signs of tampering with the enclosure, that there are no appendages or even wires hanging off of it. And as a matter of fact, actually, there's a great video of mine, I think I found it on YouTube, that I've used for awareness training that showed where a team of people came in and were distracting a clerk as somebody popped on a replacement cover onto the POS device that had a skimmer built into it. So, and if I recall, I think that was might have been even 3D printed. So, that's also need to have an awareness, quite frankly, of just, what's the device's fit and finish, right? In this case, so my understanding is I think it was painted and it looked very much like the original Verifone. But nonetheless, though, that was something else that was popped on there. So, I think documenting it for guidance and as well as just kind of educating the folks of this is what this device looks like, what it does, and, just having an awareness of any changes to it.
Steve, do you have anything to add to that? Anything, especially when you're dealing with customers with a large number of locations?
Yeah, I actually have seen in a couple of recent assessments where while they did have a fairly good awareness program documented for device tampering per requirement 9.9.2, I think it is, they didn't really actually do what they said they would do. So when you have a company that's got, say, 700 retail locations or 1,000 retail locations, trying to get that messaging and awareness down to everyone, especially when you're dealing with people that are actually handling the cards at the registers, typically that's a high turnover kind of role or position at a company. So a store or retail location manager is the one that's usually charged with doing the actual tampering inspection. But even then, we've seen gaps where they're not doing it, even though it's documented that they're supposed to according to their company policies, and PCI requires that they do so in 9.9. So it's definitely important that you do what you say you do, and a QSA will definitely ask and verify that you are doing that.
Yeah, no, great feedback, Steve. I think one thing to highlight is we work with a lot of customers or a lot of merchant customers that have either retail front locations, restaurant locations, and things of that nature. And it's that store operations piece that is so critical that compliance and IT are in lockstep, working together to make sure that that everybody agrees upon what processes they will own and be responsible for. Because that's where we see some of those breakdowns, is when those parts of the organization aren't talking and working together well. Those processes, even though they may be documented, they don't happen or they don't happen consistently, and then that creates issues with becoming compliant. So, but no, thanks for the insight. So, Steve, I'm going to come back to you. So this is the final question that was provided to us during the registration period. So this question is, does incorporating wireless technology hurt my chances of becoming or staying PCI compliant?
That's a good question, and I think we all know that wireless is everywhere, right? So obviously, incorporating wireless does not hurt your chances, but as with anything, there's a proper way to implement, secure, and manage technology, and wireless is the same. And this goes back to the scope item that we talked about a few minutes ago, is you really have to determine to what extent wireless is in scope, and there are requirements, regardless of whether you're intentionally using cardholder data wireless to access the cardholder data environment or CDE. But if you are, then there are definitely a number of other requirements that must be in place and managed properly in order to be compliant with PCI DSS. That actual state of compliance is really an individual case-by-case basis. I mean, there's no one-size-fits-all when it comes to, if you're using wireless technology A, you're going to be doing steps 1, 2, and 3, and QSA will attest to A, B, C, and D. It just doesn't work that way. That's why, as Brian stated before, being very clear on your scope up front and exactly which networks, both wired and wireless, are in scope and which aren't, makes it a lot easier for you to close those gaps and get to the compliant state.
Yeah, thank you, Steve. So with that said, we're going to move on to. We did receive a handful of questions that have been submitted. If you have more, please submit them while we're going through these. So I'm going to ask a few questions that were submitted during the webinar. So the first one, I'm going to come back to Tim. So that question is credit card data out of scope of PCI compliance? Is encrypted card data out of scope of PCI compliance?
Okay. Well, I think it depends on the implementation. So, well, first and foremost, encrypted cardholder data is still in scope. So it can be, reversed, decrypted, things like that. So if you have access to the keys, so the council tells you, so encrypted, not encrypted is always in scope. But it depends because now we have more and more retailers, right, that are implementing the point-to-point encryption, P2P terminals. So in that case, they don't have access to the encryption keys, so thus they can't decrypt it. So anything downstream from that PIN pad is going to be out of scope. So given that scenario, if that's what the customer is talking about, right, then, that encrypted data would be out of scope because, the merchant, assuming this is a merchant question, wouldn't be able to have access to it. So I think it just depends, but if you have access to the keys, especially if you encrypted it, it's definitely going to be in scope, but if you used another service provider, another device or something like that, you can't decrypt it, then very likely not in scope. This goes back to, though, probably having the need for a gap assessment, so that way that you can have somebody just take a quick look at that and provide some more specific guidance. Hope that answers it.
Yeah, thank you for clarifying that. That's as QSAs, I know it's been beat into our head that encrypted data is in scope, but that is an interesting scenario with the advent of point-to-point encryption. That is becoming a more and more common implementation with our merchant customers, and that is a way to definitely reduce your scope greatly when you don't have the keys. So we definitely see that a lot. So Steve, I'm going to come back to you with this next question that was asked. So this is actually in reference to some of the new PCI 3.2 controls. And the specific question is, what all is expected to comply with the new requirement 6.4.6? And for those on the phone who don't know what that is, it's the change management processes to confirm that after a PCI DSS requirements are in place after a significant change. So just making sure that change management is incorporated, I guess. So I guess the question is, what all is expected to comply with that new change?
Yeah, that's actually good question, and it's fairly broadly determinable by the actual client that's being assessed, because really it comes down to determining what you deem significant change in your environment. And I think the real intention of the council with this additional requirement was that we were seeing as QSAs and they were seeing as they QA'd our reports of QSA companies that it was becoming obvious that there were a lot of companies that didn't have they had a change management process, but they didn't really have a way to properly reach back out into the affected areas of the organization when changes were made, whether they were PCI or not. And change management ideally works when you go do an after action or a post-implementation review, and you see that, okay, well, we changed the configuration of firewalls for in-scope systems for our CDE. Shouldn't that have triggered perhaps a configuration standards document update? Or maybe it should have required that we do some rules verification and analysis because it was a significant change according to how we do business. So what wasn't happening is companies weren't going back and hitting all the PCI touch points related to the things that were being affected. And it should be fairly well defined in your change management process that you have those after action or post-implementation PIRs, as they call them in the business, the post-implementation reviews, and go back there and make sure that all the things that could have been affected by the change, and typically that's documentation, have been updated properly. Because when the PCI QSA comes in to assess and sample your changes and verify that all of the 6.4.5 sub-requirements were hit for change, management, they're going to go ahead and ask you that question.
Thanks, Steve. No, I appreciate that. Appreciate that insight. It looks like we're coming up on the end of the 30 minutes, but it looks like I'm going to try and squeeze in one or two more questions if possible. So Tim, I'm going to actually come back to you. This is actually a good question that, especially when we're dealing with smaller merchants and customers. And the question is, how many faxes does it take to make it within scope? So again, for this particular individual, they said they get 50 or so a year. But I guess the question really is how, is there a limitation defined in terms of what's in scope or not based on the quantity?
Yeah. So if I understand it right, the question was how many faxes determines it?
Yeah, I guess I'm assuming based on the question that I receive 50 credit card faxes per year. Is that in scope, or is there a limit to how many before it's in scope?
Yeah, so this is kind of the difficulty sometimes with PCI assessments. It's that yes, no, black white approach to it, right? Where there isn't something that defines after X amount, right? Given that scenario, and so that's kind of what I was getting at when I had responded earlier was that we've had had customers do like electronic service. I actually had somebody that had this very same scenario where it was like they had very few faxes they ever received as part of their process, but it wasn't something they could just turn the switch off. So unfortunately, 1 or 1,000, it doesn't matter, right? So it's cardholder data; it has to be protected, and so that's where I went with the recommendation of, hey, you know what? Let's look at some online service providers. It's going to be minimal cost. They're going to encrypt that data for you and maintain it and control it and protect it, and that might ease the pain. So, but that's the unfortunate reality of PCI. So I'm sorry, I don't have a better answer for you on that, but that's what we've dealt with before and how we kind of got around it versus you having to turn your building upside down to accommodate a handful of faxes you get throughout the year.
Yeah, I think what's interesting is PCI is not risk-based. They're trying to incorporate more things that would enable that, but today it is very prescriptive rather than risk-based. And so we've actually dealt with a couple of quick examples. Is we had a retailer, a global retailer with a lot of different storefronts and so on that 95% of their environment was converted to the point-to-point encryption solution. But they still had 5% with all these different, I'd say 40-plus card functions across the organization. And it definitely made it very difficult, even though the volume was not that high. And we, in some cases, we were able to eliminate a few of them, but because of just business requirements, some could not be eliminated. And so we had to work very closely with them to get those in compliance and even get some feedback from the bank to potentially see if there's any way to be lenient. And I know in one case with a different retailer, we actually worked with them to minimize. There was one specific card function that just had a handful of cards, and they allowed us to do kind of a subset of the requirements that they approved. But again, that's one of those things where it's just a one-off that the bank was able to make that risk-based determination. But you as a merchant or a service provider can't make that. You'd have to work with your bank. Or you're required to get some kind of approval, and that's pretty rare typically. So, but I guess with that said, we are coming up right at the end of our 30 minutes, so we want to be very respectful of your time. So with that said, I would say thank you for joining for our webinar today. As a reminder, each of you will receive a post-event email that will include a full recording of today's webinar, as well as a copy of the slides and some of the resources to help you with PCI compliance. Where you have questions, please contact your account manager or reach out to Accudata directly. With that said, thanks again and have a great day.